Okay, let's unpack this. When you think of the Nuremberg trials, what's the first image that comes to mind?
Well, for most people, it's pretty clear-cut. It's decisive justice.
Right. The end of the biggest war in history. You get this feeling of unambiguous moral clarity. The bad guys are in the dock, the laws are set in stone, and the book is closed.
It's a very clean narrative, isn't it?
Mm,
Good prevails over evil, and it's all enshrined in international law.
exactly. But that's the convenient narrative, the one that's easy to remember.
It is. But today, we're diving deep into the immediate aftermath of those trials. And we're pulling from sources that show that for the global elite, for jurists, for high-ranking military commanders, diplomats, the verdict was far from settled.
So this isn't a modern revisionist take.
Not at all. In fact, for a huge and really influential body of contemporary opinion, right at that moment, the trials were seen not as a triumph for international law, but as a catastrophic legal and political error.
And the lightning rod for all this criticism, the man whose conviction really brought all this to a head, is our subject today, Grand Admiral Karl Doenitz.
That's him, commander of the German U-boat fleet, a career naval professional. And for about a week, the man who succeeded Hitler as the final head of state of the Third Reich. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in Spandau prison.
And our source material for this is, well, it's pretty unique, isn't it?
It's absolutely critical and, frankly, often overlooked. We're looking at excerpts from a volume called Doenitz at Nuremberg, a reappraisal. And this isn't just a simple history book. It's a compilation.
A compilation of what, exactly?
He gathers the critical, often unpublished views of over 400 leading figures from that era. We're talking military, law, diplomacy, people who were active during the war and had real skin in the game. Early reviewers called it the most important work on this subject in 25 years.
So we are getting the immediate informed criticism from people like what? U.S. Supreme Court justices, Allied fleet admirals, sitting senators.
All of them. People who lived and breathed these issues of war and law back in 1945, 1946.
Okay, so what's the mission of this deep dive then?
The mission is to uncover the really profound legal and professional criticisms they leveled against the trials, using Doenitz's conviction as the case study. These sources, they're unified this deep professional concern that the proceedings were conducted with, and this is a quote, utter sham, hypocrisy, and blatant illegalities.
Wow, strong words.
Very. They were less worried about the guilt of the Nazis for their atrocities and more about the corrosive effect the trial itself would have on the future of law.
It sounds like we're about to pull back a curtain on a very uncomfortable conversation the world was having right after the victory parades ended.
That's a perfect way to put it.
All right, let's start with the man himself, Doenitz. He wasn't really a political ideologue in the same way as, say, Goering or Ribbentrop. He was a Navy man through and through.
That's right, a dedicated naval professional. Yet he still faced 3 very serious charges from the International Military Tribunal, the IMT.
What were they specifically?
The first was conspiring to wage aggressive war. The second was actually waging aggressive war. And the third was violation of the laws of war at sea.
Okay, and this is where it gets interesting right away. Because the tribunal acquitted him of that first charge, conspiracy.
Yes, and that is absolutely crucial. They found no evidence that he was one of the original planners. He wasn't in the room when Hitler and his inner circle were plotting the whole thing.
Oh, but they convicted him on the other 2. Waging war and war crimes at sea. And that's the paradox that just baffled professionals around the world, didn't it?
It baffled them completely. Because if you're acquitted of conspiring to start the war, how can you then be convicted for waging it? It's just a soldier just doing his job under orders from his government is now personally liable for the politics of the war itself.
It's a fundamental challenge to the whole concept of military duty.
Absolutely. And this critique was put so powerfully by Justice William L. Hart from the Supreme Court of Ohio. He has this amazing rhetorical question.
What was it?
He said, how in the name of common sense a military officer can wage any kind of war except an aggressive one without being a traitor to his country? I'll never know.
That puts it pretty bluntly.
It does. Justice Hart saw this specific conviction as the outstanding example of barefaced hypocrisy at Nuremberg.
That phrase, barefaced hypocrisy, seems to be the key theme, especially from other naval officers.
It comes up again and again. Rear Admiral Dan V. Gallery, a famous U.S. Navy officer, called it exactly that, barefaced hypocrisy and an insult to our submariners.
So why was that third charge, the violation of the laws of war at sea, so explosive among his peers, even on the Allied side?
It all centers on unrestricted submarine warfare. This was a practice supposedly outlawed by something called the 1936 Protocol.
Okay, what was the 1936 protocol?
It was an international agreement that basically tried to make submarine warfare chivalrous. It said submarines had to follow what were called cruiser rules.
Cruiser rules. What does that mean for a submarine commander in the middle of a war zone?
It meant you had to surface, you had to warn a merchant ship, and you had to ensure the safety of the crew, like literally put them in lifeboats and give them provisions before you could sink the ship. The whole idea was to stop what happened in World War I, with ships going down without any warning.
But in World War II, merchant ships were armed, they had radios. Wouldn't following those rules be a death sentence for the U-boat?
Precisely. The second a U-boat surfaced, it was a sitting duck for the ship's deck gun, or for an airplane that would be there in minutes. So Doenitz's defense was based on two things: the doctrine of reprisals and simple military necessity.
Let's define doctrine of reprisals. What does that mean in this context?
It's an old concept in the law of war. It basically says that if your enemy violates a rule of war, you are then legally allowed to respond in kind, to retaliate, to force them back into compliance.
So the argument was the Allies broke the rules first.
That's the core of it. Professor H.A. Smith, a major figure in international law at the time, argued that this doctrine had basically destroyed any objective law of war. He said, each belligerent decides for himself which of the rules it will suit him to observe.
So once the Allies started arming merchant ships and telling them to ram U-boats on sight, the rule book was effectively thrown out.
That was the defense. They argued that Allied orders had assimilated merchant ships to warships. They weren't passive civilian vessels anymore. They were part of the war effort. So they lost the protection of the 1936 Protocol.
And what did the IMT, the tribunal, say about that argument?
This is where it gets really murky, and according to the critics, pretty embarrassing for the tribunal. They actually acknowledged that Doenitz's defense was valid.
They did.
They did. They found that because of Allied practices, it was impossible to obey the protocol. And then, to top it all off, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, sent an affidavit to the trial.
And what did it say?
It said that the U.S. Navy had practiced unrestricted submarine warfare from day one of the war in the Pacific.
Wait a minute. So the tribunal admits the rules were impossible to follow, and the top American admiral admits the U.S. did the exact same thing. So how on earth did they still convict Doenitz on that charge?
This is the pivot that just infuriated the professional critics. They basically gave him a pass for sinking enemy merchant ships. But then they convicted him for sinking neutral ships inside what the Germans called operational zones.
What's an operational zone?
There's a huge area of the ocean, usually near Allied supply routes, where Germany announced they wouldn't distinguish between military and commercial traffic anymore. The defense argued this was a necessity of modern total war.
And the tribunal's take?
They said the 1936 Protocol made no exception for these zones. So they punished Doenitz for a tactic used in World War I, while at the same time admitting the core of the treaty had been made obsolete by Allied actions.
It sounds like they were desperately searching for a technicality to make a conviction stick.
That is exactly how the critics saw it. Professor Smith pointed out the clumsiness and obscurity of the tribunal's language here, suggesting they were embarrassed. The professional naval view was much simpler. An admiral in the Spanish Navy, Don Alfonso Arriaga Adam, just said the rules had become inapplicable and impossible to observe.
So in the end, Doenitz was condemned by a court for doing the only kind of submarine warfare that was possible, while Allied commanders who did the same thing were celebrated as heroes.
Exactly. Admiral Gallery called it an insult to every Allied submariner who had done the very same thing to win the war.
Okay, so the specific charges against Doenitz are already full of these glaring inconsistencies. But if you zoom out from submarine warfare and look at the legal framework of the trials themselves, the sources reveal an even more fundamental challenge.
They do, and this one goes right to the core of Anglo-American law, the problem of ex post facto law.
Let's define that for everyone, ex post facto.
It literally means from a thing done afterward. In law, it means you can't retroactively declare something a crime. You can't be punished for breaking a rule that didn't exist when you acted.
And that's a cornerstone of American law. It's in the Constitution.
It is. Article 1, Section 9. And the chief Republican spokesman in the Senate at the time, Senator Robert A. Taft of Ohio, made this his central argument against the trials.
What did he say?
He was unsparing. He said he was repelled by the picture of his country discarding those constitutional precepts in order to punish a vanquished enemy. His point was that the crime of waging aggressive war had never been defined as a punishable individual offense in any law book before the war started.
So, in Taft's view, the London Charter, which set up the IMT and basically invented these new crimes after the fact, was fundamentally illegitimate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He argued that the U.S. was sacrificing its own principles of fixed pre-existing law for a more totalitarian idea of flexible, politically convenient law. He warned it would discredit the whole idea of justice in Europe for years to come.
And that, of course, feeds right into the bigger, more common critique that the trials were simply victor's justice.
That phrase became the shorthand for the whole proceeding among its critics. The belief was that this wasn't really a court of law. It was vengeance, it was political justice dressed up in judicial robes, and therefore it could never, ever be impartial.
We have some pretty blunt examples of this from the sources, don't we?
We do. The Chicago Tribune, the day after the sentences were handed down, ran an editorial. It said flat out that no one of the victors was free of the guilt which its judges attributed to the vanquished.
And there was a French author, Roger Parafit, who was even more direct.
He called the trials no more than vengeance and reprisal, and he compared them to a kangaroo court, saying it was less honest than in ancient times when the victors would just parade their defeated enemies through the city and execute them without any legal pretense.
And if the legal foundation was that shaky, the sources suggest the conduct of the judges and prosecutors was?
Well, it was even worse. The source material is truly disturbing here. U.S. Judge Francis Biddle, one of the main American figures on the tribunal, admitted years later in an article that the American judges knowingly permitted the Soviet prosecutor to admit false evidence.
They knowingly allowed false evidence. Why?
He said it was necessary for the political goals of the tribunal, basically to keep the Soviet delegation happy and on board. He admitted that political goals trumped the search for truth.
That's a direct subversion of the judicial process, but you're saying it gets even worse.
It does. U.S. Justice Robert H. Jackson, the chief American prosecutor, he hosted a party for the Soviet prosecutor, Andrei Vyshinsky.
And Vyshinsky was not just any prosecutor.
No. This was the man who was the state prosecutor for Stalin's infamous purge trials in the 1930s, the Moscow Show trials. He was the symbol of Stalinist judicial terror. And at this party, Jackson led a toast, which the American judges joined.
The toast was?
To the German prisoners, may they all be hanged.
That is just. It's jaw-dropping. American judges, who are supposed to be impartial, are toasting the execution of defendants before the trial is even fully over?
It completely destroys any claim to impartiality. And on top of that, the procedural rules were fundamentally unfair. The tribunal accepted written depositions as evidence, but then often denied the defendants the right to cross-examine the people who wrote them.
You can't confront your accuser. That's a basic right.
And it was a right that was supposedly guaranteed in the London Agreement that set up the court in the first place. So the tribunal was violating its own founding charter.
So with all this happening, the defense counsel tried to appeal to a higher authority. They tried to get the U.S. Supreme Court involved.
They did, with a writ of habeas corpus.
Hmm.
They argued that since the U.S. military was holding the prisoners, the U.S. Constitution had to apply.
And how did the Supreme Court handle that constitutional hot potato?
They dodged it masterfully. First, in 1946, they just claimed they had no jurisdiction because the IMT was not a tribunal of the United States.
But American judges, American prosecutors, American jailers.
Exactly. The critics pounced on that.
Yeah.
So the court had to address it again in 1950 in a case called Johnson v. Eisentrager.
And what was their final ruling?
In a split decision, they ruled that a non-resident enemy alien had no access to U.S. courts. They basically created a barrier based on nationality and location.
But the dissents in that case are incredibly powerful, aren't they?
They are legendary legal arguments. Justice Hugo L. Black called the majority's reasoning utter hypocrisy. He asked if a prisoner's rights really depend on where the government chooses to imprison him.
And Justice William O. Douglas went even further.
He did. He asserted the principle that the Constitution follows the flag. He said if an American general is holding a prisoner, the Constitution can reach that prisoner wherever he is. For the critics, these dissents just confirmed that the Supreme Court had made a political decision to protect the Nuremberg Project from any real constitutional scrutiny.
Okay, so we've got a legal foundation based on retroactive law, a judicial process that critics called biased. But the content of the verdicts was also attacked for its inconsistency.
Yes, and specifically for a glaring double standard between how they treated the submarine service and their complete silence on Allied unrestricted aerial bombardment.
The torpedo versus the bomb.
It was the single greatest moral weakness of the trials. The sources just keep asking, what is the substantial difference between a torpedo from below and a bomb from above? I mean, aerial bombs carried heavier loads, caused far greater destruction, and often targeted civilians indiscriminately.
So if Doenitz is a war criminal for sinking ships without warning, why weren't the Allied air chiefs who flattened entire cities also in the dock?
The blunt answer from the critics is that Allied actions like the firebombing of Dresden, which they called a wholly non-military objective, and of course the atomic bombs, would have been considered war crimes par excellence by the tribunal's own definitions.
So they had to be, as one source put it, swept under the Nuremberg rug.
They had to be. You couldn't condemn one without condemning the other. The scale is just staggering. Submarine warfare killed hundreds at a time. Aerial warfare killed hundreds of thousands.
Tell me more about the specific outrage over the atomic bombs. That must have been intense.
It was. You had General George Cosmas stating that no act deserves the description cold-blooded murder more fittingly than the throwing of the two A-bombs. The sheer scale of indiscriminate death was a profound moral crisis that the Nuremberg framework just completely ignored.
And there was the author Taylor Caldwell.
She called the bombings one of the blackest spots on our recent black and red history, and a flat-out crime. So this wasn't just some fringe legal debate. It was a moral accusation from mainstream cultural figures.
And it raised some frightening possibilities for the future, didn't it?
It did. Senator William E. Jenner argued that if you accept the Nuremberg precedent as valid international law, then the U.S. president and the cabinet officers who ordered the use of the atomic bomb could, logically, be put on trial themselves.
He was basically saying, we've created a weapon that can be used against us.
A two-edged sword. And some sources even challenge the whole narrative of who started indiscriminate bombing in the first place.
How so?
They cite the work of F.J.P. Veal, who argued that it was actually the British, not the Nazis, who first abandoned precision bombing in favor of deliberately targeting German working-class residential areas. It was another way to undermine the moral high ground the Allies were claiming.
Let's circle back to that other charge against Doenitz. Waging aggressive war. This was a brand new crime. How did the critics deal with the problem of defining who the aggressor even is?
They found it was functionally impossible to define impartially. Admiral Arriaga Adam of Spain put it cynically, the aggressor will always be the losing party.
And even the chief prosecutor, Justice Jackson, acknowledged this was a problem.
He did. He said in open court that the proceeding had to condemn aggression by any nation, including those which sit here now in judgment.
But it didn't. It only applied the condemnation retroactively to the losers.
Exactly. And the critics tied all of this back to one key Allied political policy, unconditional surrender.
How does unconditional surrender connect to the war crimes debate? That seems like a political strategy.
The argument is that this policy prolonged the war unnecessarily. By demanding total capitulation with no terms, it forced the Germans into a corner where surrender just wasn't a rational option.
So it necessitated more extreme, total war tactics on both sides just to bring the war to an end.
Precisely. If your political decisions create the necessity for military officers to fight to the bitter end with every weapon they have, how can you then turn around and convict that officer as a criminal for doing his job? The whole moral basis for the charge just collapses.
And this brings us to what might be the most damaging consequence of the trials, at least from a military perspective. This existential dilemma it created for the professional soldier.
It really did. It struck at the very heart of the military profession, which is the principle of obedience.
Which has to be almost absolute for a military to function. The sources cited a historical legal principle to back this up, right?
They did. They kept bringing up a quote from Daniel Webster in a famous case from 1842. He said, "An individual, acting under the authority of his government, is not to be held answerable as a private malefactor."
The soldier is an agent of the state, not a freelance criminal. The responsibility lies with the government that gives the order.
That's the idea. Major General John Medeiros recalled being taught at West Point that discipline was the instant and willing obedience to all orders. There's no room in that definition for a soldier to make his own moral judgment about the war's legitimacy.
But Nuremberg completely flipped that. It told the soldier, no, you are personally responsible for the political nature of the war.
And that's where you get that absolutely chilling observation from Field Marshal Bernard L. Montgomery, one of the most famous Allied commanders of the war.
His famous quote,
"The Nuremberg trials have made the waging of an unsuccessful war a crime. The generals on the defeated side were tried and then hanged.
The only real war crime is losing.
That became the takeaway. And you have to ask, what does a precedent like that do for future wars? The critics said it incentivizes total brutality.
How so? It seems counterintuitive.
Well, General Sir Henry Charles Lloyd pointed out the impossible choice it gives a commander. You can either refuse an order and be court-martialed by your own side, or you could obey the order, lose the war, and be tried as a war criminal by the enemy.
So you're doomed either way.
Exactly. So he concluded that a commander will just choose to fight to the very end. It encourages them to win at all costs under any circumstances and to strip away all the niceties of war. There's no incentive for restraint if defeat means a noose.
So instead of creating rules to humanize war, the trials might have actually encouraged total savagery.
That was the fear. Vice Admiral Settle said commanders will just adopt a fatalistic philosophy and dare not consider surrendering. The only successful legal defense becomes unconditional victory.
And beyond the professional military concerns, there was a huge geopolitical critique about who was sitting on the judge's bench, specifically the Soviet Union.
The criticism there was exceptionally harsh. Many Western observers saw their own country's participation with the Soviets as subservience to godless communism. Admiral Fechteler said Soviet Russia was dripping with the blood and guilt of the Katyn massacre while acting as a judge.
The Katyn massacre being the mass execution of Polish officers by the Soviets, which the Soviets then tried to blame on the Germans at the trial itself.
Yes. So the argument was simple. How can you establish international law with a partner who has zero respect for the rule of law? And this led directly to what the critics saw as the most terrifying prediction of all.
Which was that the U.S. had set a legal trap for itself.
That was the clear warning from General Albert C. Wiedemeyer. He said that if the Soviets ever won a future war, the U.S. President, the Secretary of Defense, every high commander could expect to be put on trial as a war criminal, using the very precedent set at Nuremberg.
And his final line on that was the real kicker.
It was. He said, "We would think it barbarous, of course, but after all, we started it." That was the ultimate fear, that the perceived injustice of Nuremberg would just become the justification for the next round of political show trials.
So when you pull it all together, this deep dive shows that the common image we have of Nuremberg as this moment of pure moral and legal consensus is, well, it's just not the full picture.
Not even close. Immediately after the war, many of the world's most experienced legal and military minds were fiercely debating its legitimacy. And, not to absolve the Nazis of their horrors, but because they genuinely feared the precedent the victors' methods were setting.
And we've seen those criticisms fall into three main categories, right?
That's right. First, the challenge to legality, the whole problem of ex post facto law that Senator Taft condemned. Second, the challenge to impartiality, with the shocking bias of the judges in that infamous toast. And third, the challenge to consistency, that clear double standard between the U-boat and the bomber.
And the overarching concern among the sources in Doenitz at Nuremberg was really about the corrosive effect this would all have on the rule of law itself.
Yes, they saw it as a moment where political victory just completely overshadowed legal principle. And they believed that, in the long run, that would weaken the post-war world, not strengthen it.
There's a quote in the source material from the historian F.J.P. Veal that really summarizes this cynical outcome, isn't there? It's his functional definition of what a war crime became after Nuremberg.
It's a chilling summary. Let's hear it.
He wrote, "A war crime is an act committed by a member of a vanquished state, which, in the opinion of the conquerors of that state, is a war crime, but which act is not an offense which has been so flagrantly and openly committed by the conquerors themselves that mention of it would cause them embarrassment."
I mean, that just lays it bare. A war crime is something the loser did that the winner didn't do, or at least didn't do so openly that it's awkward to talk about. It replaces law with political power.
Absolutely. And that leads us to our final thought for you, the listener. If the stated goal of Nuremberg was to establish permanent, fixed principles of international law to prevent future atrocities, did setting such a controversial and selectively applied precedent actually achieve the opposite?
If these contemporary critics were right, the trials didn't establish a rule of law for all time. Instead, they codified a dangerous rule of power one that encourages total warfare, where victory becomes the only moral and legal defense and defeat becomes the only real crime. It's a question that challenges the entire foundation of modern international justice.